August 1945. With trembling hands, Sergeant Hiroshi Tanaka lifts a metal cup to his lips, bracing for poison, only to taste something utterly alien. A sweet, fizzy liquid that surges through him like liquid lightning. Across the Nevada sun-baked camp, American guards toss half-eaten hamburgers into trash barrels without a glance. Tanaka weeps, not from cruelty, but from a realization more terrifying than death. In Japan, soldiers fought over single grains of rice. Here, Coca-Cola flowed by the millions, and meat was stacked by the ton. Why did Japanese POWs cry over hamburgers and soda in American camps? Because what they saw predicted the annihilation of their nation's war strategy and the birth of a global culture they could not yet comprehend. How did a taste become a turning point? The answers begin now. At Camp 371, the numbers told a story, even before the prisoners could. On the second morning, U.S. Army medics lined up the new arrivals for health inspections, clipboard in hand, scales set on the gravel. Each man stepped forward, boots scraping, eyes fixed on the ground. The medics recorded weights, measured arms, and checked for signs of malnutrition. For most, the numbers were shocking. Bones pressed tight against skin. The average body mass was nearly 20% below American standards. The camp's intake ledger for August 1945 shows a pattern. Within 2 weeks, Japanese POWs gained an average of 3% body weight. Private Minoru Keiya, recorded at 108 pounds on arrival, weighed in at 115 just 14 days later. His card, marked with a red pencil, read, "Digestive reacclimatization complete." The medics compared these figures to the previous month's intake of German prisoners. None had gained so much so quickly. The contrast couldn't have been starker. In Japan, Keiya had survived on millet gruel and rainwater, scraping by on less than 1,000 calories a day. Here, the daily ration topped 3,800 calories. White bread, beef stew, mashed potatoes, and Coca-Cola by the bottle. Inspection tallies from September list similar jumps for Sergeant Hajime Makondo and Private First Class Kenji Yamada. 7, even 9 pounds gained in the first 2 weeks. The Red Cross observer, Dr. Hans Keller, noted in his report visible improvement in physical condition. POWs appear confused by abundance. One entry in the camp log describes a group of prisoners crowding around the kitchen window, staring at trays of uneaten bread destined for the garbage. The numbers on the health cards told the truth. In just days, starvation faded into memory, replaced by the strange discomfort of sudden plenty. But this story isn't just about weight. The camp's data sheets, filled with numbers and check marks, captured only the surface. The real impact played out in each man's mind as the scale tipped from hunger to something far harder to understand. Sergeant Hajime Kondo stared down at the tray in his hands, steam rising from mashed potatoes and a thick slice of beef. He hesitated, glancing at the American guards who stood chatting and laughing, unconcerned. Kondo had eaten little more than boiled millet and scraps of root in Burma. Now the smell of hot meat and white bread filled his nostrils, but his stomach clenched with suspicion. Around him the mess hall buzzed with low voices, some men whispering, others just silent, eyes wide. Private Kenji Yamada sat across from him, picking at a hamburger patty, the first he had ever seen. Yamada pressed his fingertips into the soft bun, uncertain whether to eat it or hide it away. The first bites came slowly. Some prisoners nibbled, others forced down mouthfuls. But the result was the same. Within half an hour, the camp infirmary overflowed. 36 men reported sudden nausea and cramps on the first day alone. Medical logs from August 15, 1945, list acute vomiting, dietary shock as the most common complaint. Kondo doubled over behind the barracks, retching until his knees shook. Yamada, pale and sweating, confessed to the camp nurse that he feared the food had been poisoned. His words were echoed by others, men who had been taught to expect death, not mercy from their captors. Camp newsletters from that week describe the confusion. Japanese prisoners refuse rations, cite fear of chemical additives. OSS notes in the camp file mention rumors spreading among the new arrivals. Some believed they were being fattened for medical experiments. Others whispered about cannibalism. The guards, baffled, tried to reassure them by eating from the same trays, but suspicion lingered. For days, trays returned half-eaten, and the kitchen staff logged record amounts of untouched bread and beef scraped into waste bins. The contrast couldn't have been starker. In Japan, Kondo had once fought over a handful of beans. Here he watched a guard toss away a hamburger after 2 bites. The numbers in the camp's medical ledger told only part of the story. The true shock was written on the faces of men who had survived on hope and hunger, now confronting a world where food was plentiful, but trust was in short supply. 5 refrigerated rail cars pulled into Camp Shelby's siding in June 1944, each packed with 40,000 pounds of beef. The numbers staggered even the quartermasters who signed off on the manifest with a mechanical pencil and a shake of the head. In the camp kitchens, Corporal Akira Okimoto was handed the job of butcher. His orders: prepare 2,000 pounds of beef every week for the POW compound alone. Okimoto had never seen so much meat in one place. The storeroom stayed cold and humming, filled with sides of beef stacked on metal hooks, the air sharp with the smell of fat and ice. Every morning, Okimoto and his crew sharpened knives and started the daily grind. They trimmed steaks, diced roasts, and ground hamburger, hundreds of patties at a time. The kitchen logs from June read like a ledger of excess: trays of beef stew, roast brisket, and hash. Enough to serve every prisoner twice over. But the real shock came with the waste. Kitchen audits from that summer record up to 300 pounds of beef thrown out each week. Fat, gristle, and untouched portions scraped straight into the bins. Guards, pressed for time or appetite, tossed half-eaten steaks, barely touched burgers, a casual flick of the wrist sending food to the garbage. Okimoto, raised in a country where a scrap of dried fish could be a family's dinner, watched in silence as the waste piled up. Private Shiro Abe wrote in his diary, "In Japan, rice was fortune, beans a luxury. Here, Americans feed meat with both hands and throw away the rest." The contrast couldn't have been starker. Red Cross inspectors noted the abundance, remarking on stores that never emptied and mess halls that never ran out. For the prisoners, the mountain of meat was more than just food. It was proof, visible, undeniable, that America's power ran deeper than its weapons. It was a daily reminder, carved and discarded, of a world where supply lines never broke and hunger was a choice. Scrip changed hands quietly at Camp Shelby, passed from palm to palm like a secret. Each prisoner earned up to 80 cents a day, not in real money, but in camp-issued coupons. With these, men could visit the PX, a squat, whitewashed building behind the mess hall, and buy small luxuries: chocolate bars, cigarettes, sometimes even a bottle of Coca-Cola. The canteen ledger for August 1944 tells its own story. 1,340 chocolate bars sold in a single month, along with hundreds of sodas and tins of fruit. For men who had once counted individual beans, the chance to choose a treat felt almost unreal. Sergeant Katsuya Mori, a former schoolteacher from Saitama, spent his first wages on a single scoop of vanilla ice cream. The Mississippi sun pressed down at 100 degrees, sweat beading on his brow as he sat on the wooden bench outside the PX. He described the moment later in a letter home, never mailed. "The cold stung my teeth. I tasted sweetness and salt. I thought of my mother's rice cakes, and I wanted to cry." Private Shiro Abe, whose diary pages are now brittle with age, wrote about the first time the PX delivered Coca-Cola on ice. The camp staff wheeled out a battered metal cooler packed with bottles. Prisoners lined up, scrip in hand, uncertain whether to trust the fizzing dark liquid. Abe watched as the guards clinked their bottles together in a toast and took long, careless swigs. "In Japan," he wrote, "we drank boiled water and called it a feast. Here, even the prisoners drink like kings." Not every man spent his earnings on sweets. Some pooled their scrip to buy soap or writing paper, small reminders of dignity. But the ice cream days, when the PX handed out cones during a heat wave, became legend. Men licked melting vanilla from their fingers and stared across the fence, silent, each lost in memory. The contrast couldn't have been starker. In the camps, abundance was measured in calories and coins. For the first time, prisoners used their own agency to buy a taste of comfort, even as the world outside remained hungry. Freight trains loaded with syrup tanks and crates of empty glass bottles rumbled across the Midwest, bound for Army depots and POW camps. At Camp McCoy, the quartermaster's transport manifest from August 1945 lists 2 entire rail cars reserved for Coca-Cola shipments, a priority space usually held for ammunition or medical supplies. The syrup arrived in 55-gallon drums, each marked with the familiar red script, and was stored in locked sheds behind the mess hall. Ice blocks chipped from massive deliveries kept the bottles cold even in the late summer heat. Swiss Red Cross inspectors visiting that month photographed the unloading. American rail crews in canvas overalls hoisting crates off flat cars while guards checked the paperwork. One image shows a line of prisoners in sun-faded uniforms watching as the bottles were stacked high on wooden pallets. The inspector's report, filed in Geneva, described the scene as industrial in scale, provisioning sufficient for thousands. Coca-Cola's wartime contract guaranteed delivery to every Army installation with POWs, and the numbers were staggering. In 1945 alone, the company produced over 5 billion bottles for military use. At Camp McCoy, records show each Japanese prisoner received 2 bottles per week, with more available for purchase at the canteen. The logistics behind this operation dwarfed anything the prisoners had known. In Japan, supply trains carried sacks of rice or barrels of pickled radish. Never a luxury, never in such volume. Here, soda arrived with the same certainty as boots or rifles. The abundance was not just visible in the mess hall, but built into the rails and timetables of an entire continent. Lieutenant Masao Nakamura sat on the edge of his bunk, a Coca-Cola bottle balanced between his knees. He turned it slowly, studying the embossed script, tracing the curve of the glass with his thumb. The cap was already gone. He kept it tucked in his diary, pressed flat as evidence. Nakamura's first sip had left him speechless. The sweetness, sharper than any fruit he had tasted, made his teeth ache. In his uncensored postcard home, he wrote, "I drank a bottle of American sugar. My tongue still remembers." Across the barracks, Sergeant Kenji Awaz counted the sugar cubes it would take to equal 1 bottle. He guessed at least 10, more than his family saw in a month. Awaz's letter, intercepted by censors, described the drink as a festival in the mouth, impossible to believe. He folded the label into a paper crane, a keepsake from a world that had measured sweetness in grains, not spoonfuls. Captain Takashi Ito, older than most, watched the younger men marvel. In Japan, he'd rationed a single orange among his platoon. Here, he saw men trade bottle caps like coins, each one a small treasure. Ito's diary entry from September 3, 1945, reads, "They waste nothing here, yet they have too much. I am ashamed to envy my captors." The bottle caps piled up in drawers and pockets, proof of a new arithmetic. Each cap meant a feast of sugar, a memory stamped in metal. For Nakamura and Awaz, the numbers behind Coca-Cola were more than statistics. They were a challenge to everything they'd believed about power, scarcity, and the meaning of victory. At Camp Livingston in March 1944, a silent standoff began before sunrise. 55 Japanese prisoners, led by Sergeant Yasuo Sato, pushed their breakfast trays away and folded their arms across their chests. For 3 days, not a single grain of rice or slice of bread left the kitchen for their tables. Sato, a former railway clerk from Yokohama, kept a diary hidden beneath his mattress, noting each hour of the strike. He wrote, "If we eat, we betray our homeland. If we refuse, we may die as men." The guards waited, expecting violence or collapse. But the hunger strike never turned into a riot. Swiss Red Cross monitors present for the inspection recorded the event in their report. No force feeding required. Medical staff on alert. Prisoners show resolve, but no aggression. By the third night, men in the barracks whispered about the guards' patience, the untouched food piling up in the mess hall, and the absence of punishment. Some prisoners began to falter. The next morning, Sato watched as the youngest in his group reached for a piece of bread, hands trembling. The strike unraveled quietly, not with defiance, but with exhaustion and the creeping scent of fresh stew drifting through the air. In Japan, Sato had watched friends die for want of a meal. Here, resistance broke not under threat, but under the weight of too much food. The collective will that had survived battlefields and ocean crossings dissolved in the face of abundance. Steak night at Camp Livingston drew a hush over the mess hall. Lieutenant Kazuo Sakamaki sat at the end of a long wooden table, his dinner untouched. The plate in front of him held a thick slab of beef, pink in the center, with mashed potatoes and a wedge of pie. Around him, other prisoners picked at their food in silence, the weight of expectation pressing down. Sakamaki's hands trembled as he gripped his fork. He had survived on rice balls and brackish water, never dreaming of a meal like this. OSS observers stationed nearby took notes for file number 2234. One scribbled, "Subject does not eat, appears withdrawn, eyes fixed on plate." After the meal, Sakamaki slipped away to the barracks. The hospital log for March 17, 1944 records a late-night entry. Lacerations left wrist, treated and bandaged, patient, nonverbal. A nurse recalling the scene years later described the blood on his uniform and the blank stare. Sakamaki left no note, but in his journal, later recovered by camp staff, he had written, "If kindness is the weapon, I am already defeated." Major Hideo Iwakuro, sharing the barracks that night, later wrote of Sakamaki's dreams. Nightmares of home, of duty, of a world turned upside down by a single meal. The contrast couldn't have been starker. In Japan, death was the only escape from disgrace. Here, a steak dinner was enough to unravel a man's soul. At Camp Livingston in March 1944, a silent standoff began before sunrise. 55 Japanese prisoners, led by Sergeant Yasuo Sato, pushed their breakfast trays away and folded their arms across their chests. For 3 days, not a single grain of rice or slice of bread left the kitchen for their tables. Sato, a former railway clerk from Yokohama, kept a diary hidden beneath his mattress, noting each hour of the strike. He wrote, "If we eat, we betray our homeland. If we refuse, we may die as men." The guards waited, expecting violence or collapse, but the hunger strike never turned into a riot. Swiss Red Cross monitors present for the inspection recorded the event in their report. No force feeding required. Medical staff on alert. Prisoners show resolve, but no aggression. By the third night, men in the barracks whispered about the guards' patience, the untouched food piling up in the mess hall, and the absence of punishment. Some prisoners began to falter. The next morning, Sato watched as the youngest in his group reached for a piece of bread, hands trembling. The strike unraveled quietly, not with defiance but with exhaustion, and the creeping scent of fresh stew drifting through the air. In Japan, Sato had watched friends die for want of a meal. Here, resistance broke not under threat, but under the weight of too much food. The collective will that had survived battlefields and ocean crossings dissolved in the face of abundance. Steak night at Camp Livingston drew a hush over the mess hall. Lieutenant Kazuo Sakamaki sat at the end of a long wooden table, his dinner untouched. The plate in front of him held a thick slab of beef, pink in the center, with mashed potatoes and a wedge of pie. Around him, other prisoners picked at their food in silence, the weight of expectation pressing down. Sakamaki's hands trembled as he gripped his fork. He had survived on rice balls and brackish water, never dreaming of a meal like this. OSS observers stationed nearby took notes for file number 2234. One scribbled, "Subject does not eat, appears withdrawn, eyes fixed on plate." After the meal, Sakamaki slipped away to the barracks. The hospital log for March 17, 1944 records a late-night entry. Lacerations, left wrist, treated and bandaged, patient nonverbal. A nurse recalling the scene years later described the blood on his uniform and the blank stare. Sakamaki left no note, but in his journal, later recovered by camp staff, he had written, "If kindness is the weapon, I am already defeated." Major Hideo Iwakuro, sharing the barracks that night, later wrote of Sakamaki's dreams. Nightmares of home, of duty, of a world turned upside down by a single meal. The contrast couldn't have been starker. In Japan, death was the only escape from disgrace. Here, a steak dinner was enough to unravel a man's soul. By 1945, American factories were producing 5 billion bottles of Coca-Cola each year, while Japanese prisoners of war in camps like Shelby and Livingston received up to 3,800 calories per day, over triple the rations some had known in wartime Japan. First-hand testimonies and camp records document both the shock and relief among prisoners like Hiroshi Tanaka, who went from hunger to abundance overnight. Yet, not all personal stories survived. Many names and detailed accounts remain absent from public archives, and some camp files are still classified or lost. What is clear, however, is that the overwhelming scale of American supply chains and everyday luxuries revealed a gulf not only in resources, but also in worldview. After the war, Japan's rapid adoption of American business models and the rise of fast food chains like McDonald's in Tokyo signaled a profound transformation. Today, Coca-Cola and hamburgers are ordinary in Japan, proof that the abundance witnessed in those POW camps foreshadowed a new era. The story that began with Tanaka's trembling hands and that first sip in the Nevada sun now echoes in every glass bottle and brightly lit burger shop across modern Japan. Amen.